Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I wanted to explain the basics of GIMP to you guys in a complete tutorial for beginners. So this won't cover absolutely everything about GIMP, but this should go a long way in getting you started and understanding the program and most of the things you can do within the program. So GIMP, if you don't already know, stands for the GNU Image Manipulation Program. It's more or less a free alternative to Adobe Photoshop in that you can use the program to edit graphics and photos using a variety of tools in a layer-based editing fashion. So when I'm referring to layers, and I'll explain more about this later, I mean that you can take the changes that you make across the time that you work on an image and keep them separated from each other, so that if you ever wanted to undo some of the changes, stuff you did on one layer, it would not affect the other layers. So by working with layers, you're able to reduce the destructiveness of the modifications you make. Okay, but before we really get started with anything, I want to show you guys how you can change the color theme within GIMP. So you can see here that I use the dark color theme because I generally find it to be much easier on the eyes. So if you want to adjust your color scheme, you can go up to Edit and then Preferences. And then in this list, you can see Interface, and then there's a category for theme here. So you can select one of the themes that are default to your computer. So you have dark, gray, light, and system. It is possible to install other themes, which you can find online. Some people have made a few of them. But in this video, we're going to just stick to the default themes. So I'm using dark if you want it to look just like it does for me. So inside of the default layout of GIMP, the three most important windows are the Tools box over here on the left. That's where you see all of the basic tools that you can use within GIMP, such as the Paintbrush tool for drawing onto your image and the Rectangular Select tool for selecting part of the image document in order to make changes to specifically that region. Below the Tools window is the Tool Options. So whenever you select a tool like the Paintbrush, you're going to see a bunch of options associated with that tool down below. In addition to those two boxes, you have the Layers window in the bottom right-hand corner. So whenever you want to switch the layer you're working on, or you want to create a new layer to have changes be separated from your other work, then you'll do the majority of those type of changes in this layer window. You also notice that in most of these docked areas that there are other tabs, such as right next to the Layers window. You can switch over to the Color Channels window, and then the Paths tool becomes relevant if you start using the Pen tool to draw Bezier curves. Up in the top right, you have windows such as Brushes, which gives you a full view of all of the brushes that you have installed on your computer. So this selection is effectively the same as the tool options for the paintbrush. You can see you can select those same brushes here from this drop-down. The difference between each brush is that they will allow you to draw in a different shape. So the basic brush would be a circle with some softness on the edges. You can see it says hardness of 50. The higher the hardness setting is, the less softness you get on the edges. So if you want it to be very, very soft, you would want a hardness of 0. And if you want it to be completely solid, then you would have a hardness of 100. So we can draw at hardness 50, and you can see there that it's got some blurriness around the edges. So we could either manually set the hardness higher, like so, or we could actually just select the default hardness 100 brush from the brushes window, or using the brush select in the tool options. Either way, we get the same result. There's also the hardness 25, but you can turn that all the way down to 0 if you do that manually. So you have 0% hardness up here at the top, 25%, 50%, and 100% at the bottom. Now, the other brushes usually give you some kind of pattern that you're drawing with. So if I was to click here, this hatch pen, you can see that it will kind of show, it'll show you as you hover over the image, the shape that it's going to be drawing. So you can left click, press and hold and drag that brush in order to create strokes across your document. And you can see that by using that brush pattern, you can get a result that will look completely different than anything you can draw with the basic brush. So another example might be the sponge brush over here. You can see that it kind of spatters a little bit of ink everywhere when you draw with this brush. So I accidentally changed the color to brown there, but that actually brings up a decent point here. We can actually change the colors in this box over here in the tool selection. So the first color in the top left is your active foreground color, and then the active background color is the one that sits behind that. You can switch between those two colors at any time by hitting X. So you see I hit X and it swaps them immediately. And you can select the color you want by clicking on the box and then changing your foreground color. And you can see as I move it around that all of the values will adjust automatically over here on the right. such as the levels of red, green, blue, and the luminance value down here. You can also click on these individual values, such as the lightness, if you want to move it without actually changing the rest of the values for the color. So as I increase the lightness, the base color stays the same, but it would just become darker or brighter. Sometimes you may need to copy a color from GIMP into another program, or you may find a color you like online, and often those colors will be stored in a HTML notation. So you'll be able to recognize that because it'll usually have 6 digits, which can include letters up to F, and numbers 0 through 9. Sometimes you'll also have the HTML color have 2 extra digits at the end, which is a representation of the alpha. So the alpha of a color is how transparent it is. So if you had a 50% alpha, that would mean that it is 50% transparent. And to put things simply, you would be able to half see whatever is behind that color when you start drawing with it. There's also this color history box down here at the bottom. So you can see the colors that you've recently selected here. And if you want to take a color that you're currently selecting and put it here in the history so that you can use it in the near future, you can click on this little button here to add the color into this list of history colors. So that can be useful if you want to add a few colors for your future selection, kind of like a temporary palette. So I could go here, select a new green color, add that in there. And once you have the color you like, you can just select it and hit OK. So now when I draw with this color, we obviously get a different result there. So on the tab next to brushes, there's patterns as a selection here. So you can use patterns for things like filling in an area that you have selected. So if I take the rectangular select tool in the top left-hand corner, and let's just say I wanted to grab this area of the image, and I wanted to fill that in with the pattern. I can select the leopard skin, right-click on this area, go to Edit, and then choose Fill with Pattern. You can also see the hotkeys for any of these commands next to it, so that could be Control semicolon on your keyboard. And if you fill it in, it'll take that texture and keep applying it until it fits the entire region. Generally speaking, I find that the default textures are kind of on the weaker side. You can bring in other people's patterns from online sites like DeviantArt would be good resources for finding those kinds of things, if that interests you at all. Then over on the right to that, you have font selection. So any font that you have installed on your computer should, in theory, show up here somewhere in the fonts list. If you install a font while you're within GIMP, you'll have to restart GIMP for it to show up properly. I'll rarely use this window as well because when you use the text tool for creating titles and that sort of thing, you can select the font in the tool options as well. And then the history window over here will show you the files that you've been recently working on. So these might be just PNG images, but they may also be the .xcf files. So whenever you save a GIMP document and you want it to be editable later on, you would actually save it as a .xcf file. It's the standard file extension for GIMP. The advantage there is that you can open it up and it will still have all of the layers intact. But once you actually export a GIMP image to JPEG or PNG, it's impossible to go back and edit it in terms of layers. If you tried to load up a PNG or JPEG image into GIMP again, it would all be one layer and none of the changes would actually be reversible. So just note that before you do your final export, and you may want to save your GIMP documents in XCF format if you want to change them in the future. Now, if you want to do change history, you can see over here next to the tool options, there's a little tab here for undo history as well. So you can see the recent changes that we have made on our GIMP document here. So we have the most recent changes at the bottom and the earliest ones at the start. So if you want to reverse back to an earlier state in the document, you can either hit Control-Z to make undo changes, and you can see in this window, it'll automatically move up one level every time I hit Control-Z. And you can also move one change back up the list by hitting Control-Y. So Control-Y is your redo key and Control-Z is your undo. So Control-Y does the rectangular select, and then Control-Y again does the fill pattern. You can also scroll up on this list, and if you wanted to go all the way back to the base image, you just need to left click it once. But note that until you make a new change from this point, you can still go back in the history if you want to pick a new spot to continue working from. But as soon as you revert back to a point in your image and you make a new change, such as if I was to do the brush stroke here, you'll see that it's now on a different undo redo timeline, and all of those history changes that we had before are not reversible, even if I hit Control-Z we can't see them anymore. So be careful about that. There's also a few more windows that you don't see here. So if we go up to the menu at the top and do Windows Dockable Dialogues, you can see all of the windows for GIMP, including new ones that they've added recently, like symmetry painting. So if you wanted to have symmetry while you're drawing on your document, basically you want to draw the same thing on the left and the right side of your image, you could open up the symmetry window and do mirror, and then choose, I believe, vertical symmetry. Will make everything on the left reflect to the right. So if I draw here, then you can see how you get perfect symmetry across the axis. Now I'm going to turn that off, though we don't really need that. So now I think it would be best to talk a little bit more about layers. So as we saw earlier, I was drawing a bunch of different things onto the base. So as we saw earlier, I was drawing a bunch of things with the paintbrush straight onto the image that I imported into GIMP to work with. So if I make these brush strokes like this, maybe change to a different brush and, draw all of this on there, then all of these changes I'm making are drawing directly onto this imported layer, which just has the name of the image that I brought in. But now if I ever wanted to erase these parts, I can't actually do that in a way where we can get the data from the original image back. Once you draw over anything on a layer, then you can think of everything that was there before as having its color replaced, and it no longer really exists. So using the eraser tool, you can see that the brushes still apply, but generally you'll use more of those default hardness brushes, the ones that are just circular. What we get when we erase here is a white color. Now the reason we get white instead of transparent is because this layer has no alpha channel. So if I add a new layer here, and I'll put it in the background, I will fill it with, say, the foreground color, using that drop down at the bottom. So we can see this is a purely green layer, and I pull that behind the image layer. We can't actually see the background layer at all. And that's because the top layer has no transparency whatever. It has no alpha channel, so it does not support transparency. So the eraser tool gives us white instead of transparency. If I right-click on a layer, I can add an alpha channel by clicking on the alpha channel button. Now when we do that, this is still white. The eraser tool wrote over the colors that were behind it with a white color. And if I recall, I think that the color it actually erases to is dependent on whatever your background color is. So let's actually go ahead and test that real quick. I'll go back here, reverse to the eraser history. So we don't have the layer there and there's no alpha channel. And let's change the background color to something. And now if we erase, yeah, it erases with the background color. Okay, just wanted to confirm that. So now we need to add in the layer again. So I'm gonna create this new layer. I'll call it test background and use the foreground green. We can see that that's completely green. If I put that as the bottom layer, that means it's hiding behind the top layer. So we can't see anything because nothing has any alpha yet, but if I right click and add the alpha channel back in again, now how the eraser tool will work is that it will remove the alpha from the color we draw over with the eraser tool. So that will make it look invisible, non-existent, and will let the background show through. So if I draw over here with the eraser tool, it looks kind of like I'm drawing green, but actually what it's really doing is letting the background show through. So if I take the test background layer and I actually turn off its visibility with this eyeball icon, what you'll see is this little checker box showing in the background of the first layer. So this is what you'll see when you have transparency and nothing solid in the background. Sometimes you would actually want this if you want your exported image to be partially see-through. Every image that you export from a program like GIMP is actually going to be a square. You can give it the illusion of having a different shape by having parts of your image be transparent, such as when you want a drawn character to show, but you don't want any background. You just want the background of the web page you're viewing to show through instead of a background that's actually part of the image itself. Now, to note about that, if you don't know the difference between JPEG and PNG, it's essentially that a PNG image will allow you to keep that alpha transparency layer when you export it, meaning that it can have the transparency and let the background of the web page or whatever you're viewing show through in place of that space of the image. But if you export to a JPEG image, then all of the transparency is completely removed, and that would be replaced with a default color. The advantage of a JPEG image is that it will have a lower file size, so you don't always want PNG. If you're actually exporting a rectangular image and the entire image should have some colored data there, then a JPEG would usually be what you'd want. But if you need that transparency because you want to fake a shape that's different than a rectangle or a square, then you would want a PNG. Of course, there's other image formats out there as well, but those are pretty much the main two to know about for right now. So now that we have two layers, there's a lot of nifty tricks we could do. For instance, I can erase the data from the top layer and let whatever is the background layer show through as the new background for the final image. So right now the test background is pure green, which means anything I draw over with the eraser tool is going to show that green through, right? So at this level, we could just draw green over the top layer if we wanted. But we would run into pretty significant issues if we ever needed to change something. When, for instance, if we were drawing a background that was more complicated than just one solid color like this, and we ever wanted to change it, then we'd need to spend a lot of time to manually redefine the colors or draw in the patterns while carefully not erasing anything like this computer screen. Because if we draw on the same layer, then everything is destructive to whatever is on that layer. But by having the test background layer show through, we could simply just change the test background, which is one solid color that applies to everything that has the transparency. And what we'd be able to do is change the background color for the entire image by just doing something like a fill bucket tool on the background layer. So if I hide the home office layer here, and then I go to the fill bucket tool, maybe I'll swap the active foreground and background colors. So we're now selected with this kind of maroon red color. I can just left click here and fill the background with red. So in the final image, we don't want the entire image to just be one solid color, but if I re-enable the top layer here, what you can see is that the background layer can show through anywhere that there is that transparency. So as long as we cut out the area of the top image that we want to have the background show through, we never have to redraw over the top image if we want to change the color. We simply need to fill bucket the background, and we can define where that background should be with transparency on the top layer. So we could just select the top layer again with a left click, and take the eraser tool and keep drawing over this until we have the shape we want. And that wouldn't be too bad of a solution for getting the background to go in there. But we could also say that, we want this laptop to be isolated. But if we already know the shape of what we're trying to keep in the top layer, for instance, if we wanted to isolate this laptop, then we can use selection tools in order to draw a shape around it. So for instance, if we have something that has a pretty well-defined hard edge like this, that contrasts well against the background in the same layer, then we can use a tool like the scissors select tool in order to define some shapes and then cut away anything that's not part of this laptop computer. So I can left click here, which will set a point. And let's switch back to the tool options window here from the undo history so that we can see the options here in case we need to change them. I'll turn on interactive boundary so that if I left click, press and hold to set the next point, that we can see essentially where it's going to be making that selection on before we actually let go of the point. So it gives you a little bit of preview information. And we can let go over here for a rough selection. We might also want to turn on feather edges here if you want it to have a little bit of softness when we finally cut away this laptop. And what the scissors select tool does really well is it figures out the areas that should be between the 2 points you set as part of your object selection. So if I left click over here, that's a pretty straight line, so it doesn't really show much. But if I left click again down here, you can see that it tries to intelligently make this curve around the edge there. Now it didn't do a perfect job. So we can just left click in between those 2 points and set a third point to give it more information to kind of manually define where those points should be. And as long as you give it enough points, it can make a pretty good approximation of the shape of the object that you're trying to cut away without even knowing anything else about the object. So we can left click and hold to get that interactive boundary and just keep doing that while trying to get decent results on the edges of this computer. Anytime that the interactive boundary goes off, like where you see that black line, it's trying to trace the black line, you can just move the point up a bit and get a better result. So usually the scissors tool is going to be pretty good. The black line does kind of throw it off a little bit. So sometimes you do need to be careful. Other times you'll get very good results without actually having to put much work in at all. And then here's another good example of when the scissors select tool works well. So there's this curve here. So it knows to select the curve without me telling it anything, just by following where the colors continue onwards. And then we can add in more points down here, just essentially following along until we get a good selection of the laptop. When you get to the end of using the scissor select tool, remember to left click on the final point to complete your circuit around your object. And then you can select that object, everything inside of it, by left clicking once inside of your scissors selection. And now you can see basically the shape of the laptop has been selected. We can cut this out to a new layer, which is generally a good idea. Working with more layers is usually preferable to working with less. So if you want to make a cut of your selection, you hit Ctrl X on your keyboard. Now you can see that the laptop's been cut away. It leaves it with transparency because this layer has alpha, which means that currently the test background is going to show through. But we actually want to paste what we cut away into a new layer. So we can do that by hitting Ctrl V, which will create a floating selection pasted layer in. If we hit the Create New Layer button, this will now be a separate layer from what's below it. And this is really nice because as long as we aren't drawing on this layer, we can do anything in the background layers without affecting the laptop layer again. And we can see if we use the Move tool up here or M on the keyboard, we can take this whole new laptop layer and move it around the screen. Unfortunately, you'll notice that because we did a lot of modifications to the original image before we cut this away to its own layer, that those changes we made are kind of permanent, unfortunately. So if you have made permanent changes that you don't want, you may need to kind of start over by re-importing your image in, unfortunately. Now you can also see that the edges here are really harsh, and that looks good. That looks bad once you try to separate them. So if we actually go to the undo history and we move up to about where we have the scissors selection tool. So scissors there. And then if we click on the scissors tool, there's an option here called feather edges. So if you want to make the edges soft instead, then you're going to want to use the scissors tool with feather edges checked, and that'll add a little bit of softness whenever you cut away a selection. Much in the same way that using the paintbrush tool, you get these soft edges with a hardness that's below 100. Now, I think for the feather edges to work, you have to have that checked before you actually make the final selection, clicking inside of the boundaries of your scissors select tool. So how can we do that real quick by drawing the scissors select tool around our object? I'll just go much quicker this time, and I'll just get a rough selection here of the laptop. So this time if we select it and we cut it away to its own layer, it should have a little bit of softness around the edges. So I'm going to hide the home office layer, whatever remains. And you can see that the selection now, it has that softer edge. Often having feather edges will make things look a little bit smoother than if you just had a raw, hard edge pixel by pixel selection. So just kind of keep that in mind as you go forward. And that also applies to any other tools that use feather edges or any tools like the paintbrush that will have a hardness value setting. Okay, so now that we've separated the laptop onto its own separate layer, what's really the advantage of doing that? Well, basically, as long as it's on its own separate layer, it's safe from any changes that you're going to make on other layers. So we still have the background layer here from the original image, and we might want to edit that more. And we can just take the eraser tool, and as long as this was the only thing we cared about keeping in the final image, then we can just take the eraser tool and draw over it with basically no regard for the laptop itself, because the laptop's already been separated to its own layer, so it's safe. And you can see that there. No matter how much I draw, no matter how reckless I am here, whatever's on that separate layer is going to remain intact. Also, it's really powerful if you want to combine images. So you might take an object from one image and you want to put it onto a separate image. So for instance, I'll drop in this image that happens to have a frog. Let's take the layer and move it up to the top, so it is the top layer. Let's try to take this frog and put it on the table from the original image. So if I hide these layers, you can see that the original home office layer is in shambles. So I could just re-import that. I'm going to delete that layer completely. And from my desktop, I'm going to drag that image back into GIMP. A new layer is created. So now we just need to combine these two images. So if I want the frog to be on the table, we need to cut the frog out of this image using any selection method we want. So the scissors select tool is a really good option. You can also use paths, create a path using Bezier curves, and then create a selection from that. Select by color is a good way when the object you're trying to select is basically one color or very similar colors, such as the background. If I wanted to take this green background and kind of filter it out, I can right click and do add alpha channel on that layer. And by left clicking, you can see that you get a selection that's similar to the color you are clicking on. And if you decrease the threshold, it'll be more precise in the color selection. Doesn't work super great with the greens here because the frog also has a lot of greens. And you can also see that the grays also don't work so great because the frog also has some gray colors. So on some images it won't work as good as others. But on some images the colors will contrast enough that you can select part of your color and either cut that away or delete it. And you'd be able to get a good result without having to manually draw around a border. So you can see here, clicking on these greens, if I select that, it selects everything within the threshold. I can hit Control X to cut that away. And that would allow you to do things like remove some of this background area. So I already showed you guys the scissors select tool. Let's try doing it with the paths tool. It's actually very similar to the scissors select tool, except that with the paths tool, you do everything manually. You can either draw straight lines or draw in curves. And whenever you create a path, it'll be semi-permanently stored over. It'll be permanently stored over on this paths window. So you draw the paths once, and later you can make the selection from a path you've already created on your document. The paths don't show up on your document, but the information for the paths will always be there, unless you delete them in the paths window over here. So if you want to draw straight lines with a path tool, then you just left click, and then you left click to make your second point. If you want to make it into a Bezier curve, then you press and hold. And you can see that when I do that, you get these handles which affect the shape of the curve. Now drawing with the curves is a lot more complicated. You may have to work harder to get it just right by pulling on these handles. And then when you left click your next point, the points that come out of a path point that has the Bezier curves will also have the Bezier curve, at least on the left. So you see that the right handle affects the Bezier curve to the right of the point, and then the left Bezier curve affects the point to the left. So this can get kind of complicated. But one of the nice things about the paths tool is if you ever go away from it, like if you switch to a different tool, you can actually always go over to the paths window, right click on a path and hit edit path. So the information of your path will always be there available for you if you ever need to edit it or make a selection from your path. So if we want to add more points to the path now, we can select one of the points and then left click to add in some more points. I'm not going to be super precise about this. I'll just left click to add straight points because that's quicker and simpler. But you can spend as much time as you want when you're making your selection. So generally it will take a bit longer to use the paths tool manually to make a selection around your object. But if you add in enough points, you can probably get a little bit better result than if you just use the scissors select tool. And like before, when you want to complete the circuit, you need to manually click on the last point. In this case, I actually have to hold Control down in order to get that little linking symbol. So this will create the endpoint. And now our path is one closed circuit around this frog. We can see the shape of the path shows up on the paths window as well. So now anytime we want to select this shape in this spot from our layer, or any of our layers really, we can right click on the path in the paths window and choose path to selection. So you see when we do that, we get a selection around the frog, and we can move that to a new layer by hitting Control X and then Control V to paste that in as a new pasted layer. Hit the new layer button. And if we hide the background layer, we can see that the frog is now completely separate from the image that it was originally in. We can click away from the paths tool and the path will still technically be there. So we can always select it with right click edit path. We can just discount that for now, switch to another tool and continue editing our image. So I said earlier I wanted the frog on the desk. We could technically say that it is on there right now, but it doesn't look quite right. So what we can do is use the move tool to reposition it a little bit. And maybe we want the frog to be shrunk down a lot, because right now it's giganto size. Although, admittedly, sometimes leaving it gigantic size is a fun trick that people like to do when editing photography. So if you take a close-up of an object in one image and pull it out to an image where the shot is much further away, you can make something look way bigger than it should be. But for now, let's scale it down using the scale tool. So that is Shift-S on your keyboard, or you can click over here. And now we need to go to the pasted layer 1, which I'll double-click on the name on to rename to Frog. And I will left-click on the layer to get these scale markers. So now we have these corners which we can scale it in from. If you want to make sure that your aspect ratio for the object is maintained so that it doesn't stretch weirdly, vertically or horizontally, then make sure that the link is checked up here for the scale value. You can manually type in a pixel value if you like, or you can click on each of these corners or sides to scale the object inwards. So if we want to decrease its size, we just pull this corner inwards until it has a size and shape that makes a bit more sense for the photo. And then you hit scale, and it will adjust. Now, if you think you might later decide that that's too small and you want to scale it upwards, a better idea of scaling a small image upwards would actually be to keep a copy of this original sized image. You can duplicate a layer for later by right-clicking on the layer and hitting duplicate layer. So with this frog copy layer, we can just hide it and maybe call it frog backup. And now we can scale the visible frog layer without losing the detail of this big frog if we ever decided we want to go back. Also, one more thing, if you want to have the scaling occur without actually changing the main position, then you can hold Control down to scale around the center, which will scale inwards from all directions, scaling it from one corner down to the opposite corners. So let's scale that down there. And if I show the frog backup layer at any point in time, you can see that we still have that there hidden in the background if we need it later on. So one of the minor problems we have when we use the pen tool in order to grab this frog from the other image and bring it in, if you look at the very edges of the frog image, it doesn't blend very well with the background there, especially in these lower areas. The black parts that kind of came over from the frog image really contrast harshly against the table's surface. So one way that we can get around this is to have the outside of this image be stroked with the eraser tool to kind of smooth out the edges a little bit and add a little bit of transparency towards the outside. Similar to if we were using the paintbrush tool, you can see the soft edges there. But when we use the eraser tool, instead of drawing with a color, we draw with transparency basically. So what we need to do is to right-click on a layer, the frog layer, and do alpha to selection. So this works with all kinds of layers. It's really useful if you want to add things like drop shadow, because you can do a perfect selection of the object that you're trying to apply an effect to. Drop shadow, by the way, is a filter, and we'll touch more on filters later, but you can find it up here in filters, light and shadow, drop shadow. Well, for right now, what we actually want to do is stroke the edges of this frog with the eraser tool. So to do that with the selection already made, we right-click and we go to Edit, and then Stroke Selection down here at the bottom. You can also stroke a path if you have one made. So Stroke Selection, we're going to be stroking with a paint tool, and the tool we want is the eraser tool. So this will use whatever settings you have on the eraser tool. So you can see here brush size of 6. If you make a very large brush, then that will erase a lot of the edges. But in this case, we just want to smooth it out a little bit, so you are going to want to use a small brush size. Using the hardness brush of 50 is a decent option, because that will have that kind of smoothness, same as drawing with the paintbrush. Basically, the closer the pixels are to the center of this image, the more we want them to be faded in, and then slightly beyond that, we want it to fade out a little bit more with the transparency. So I'm going to stroke it here with the eraser tool. And when you do that, you can see that all of the edges kind of are brought in a little bit. If I was to unselect things, then it should look a little bit smoother than it did before. I'm going to undo this though, because possibly 6 pixels might be too much. So you can adjust it. Maybe bring the size down to 4 pixels or something like that. And retry it with alpha to selection. Right-click, stroke selection, using the eraser tool from the drop-down menu. So let's stroke that. So that's the after and then the before, and Control Y to make it after again. Just makes it look a little bit smoother. Not exactly perfect. Just a simple trick to make it look a little bit smoother there. So now we can reposition this kind of where we want it on the table. And if we zoom all the way out, it's not too bad. Okay, so one more thing we can do for the frog layer is to kind of bring in some of the lighting from the background image, the one with the laptop, and to kind of add it to the frog to make it look a little bit more like the frog actually belongs in the image, giving kind of the illusion that the two are lit in a similar fashion. So what we can do to do that is to put the frog in a layer group. So layer groups, when you have effects such as a color composite mode, which are the options you see here, will only apply to other layers that are in that group. So clicking on the frog, if I click create new layer group in the layers panel here, I can call this frog group, drop the frog in, and I'll also duplicate this home office layer so that we can put a copy inside of the frog group. Now temporarily I'll hide that. So the idea is that if these two layers are in the same group together, then the top layers will only apply to layers that are beneath it within the same group. So if I re-enable the home office image, you'll see that by default it covers everything behind it because it's the top layer image and it has no transparency. But if I change the color composite mode from normal to something like overlay, then what it's actually going to do is apply the lighting from the image to lower layers, rather than actually having the image itself be on top of it. So this is taking the bottom layer and creating a fusion of two layers, the home office layer and the frog layer, to create a final look inside of your image. Now there's different modes we can play around with here that will actually affect the lighting of the frog, such as soft light or hard light. You'll see that it gives you a different look depending on which one you select. So I'm thinking for this case, something like soft light. It's probably going to go the least overboard with it. So you can see at 100% opacity, which is the alpha of the layer, how much of the layer you want to show through. It doesn't look too crazily different from the original. The colors do change if we hide the home office layer, the duplicate one. And we should probably rename this layer as well. So I'll call it soft light layer. But we're not going to have it at full value. We're actually going to lower the opacity down so that more of the original color shows through for the final frog. So hiding the soft light layer and showing it, you can see that it kind of shifts everything a little bit more towards the brown color. So it's kind of a cheap way of manipulating the color on a lower layer. We can lower the opacity down a little more and just hide the soft light layer whenever you want to see the original and compare it to the newer version, and you can get an idea of how that might look. Now we might also decide that, this bottom area, it's still a little bit overly dark. It looks a little unnatural. It's not very smooth. So we might want to erase a little bit of this away. So we already know how to do that using the eraser tool and also using the stroke method. Let's add one more option in, which is to do with layer masks. So layer masks allow you to take part of a layer and prevent it from showing through, though the information from the original layer still exists. So basically a mask hides part of an image that you don't want to show through in the final product. So you can add a layer mask to any layer or layer group by right-clicking on it and doing add layer mask. So by default, we want to initialize that with white color, full opacity. You could also initialize it with black, which is full transparency. So the idea is, when you draw on a layer mask, black means it's going to be invisible and white means it's going to be visible. By default, we want to leave everything about the frog visible because we only want to take a little bit off. So I'm going to initialize it as white. So we do that and you'll see that this little layer mask has been added to the right of the layer itself. So now when we click on this layer, we have to select on the left the actual image if we want to edit that, or the layer mask on the right. So now if we use the paintbrush tool and draw with black, so note I have black selected as my foreground color, we can essentially draw black on the layer mask to hide part of the underlying frog. But if we ever deleted that layer mask, everything that we hid would come back. So this is another way of non-destructively modifying your image. So layer masks can be very, very handy when you want to hide something but not permanently delete it. Just going to come down here a little bit with the paintbrush tool at 50% hardness and smooth out a little bit of these black edges, because I think having it be black doesn't make a lot of sense when the underlying table is kind of more of a brown. So by making this partially transparent, it'll take more of the color from the table for the edges around the frog, and that just makes more sense. Okay, and the nice thing about the layer mask, like I mentioned, it's not permanent changes. is that you can also draw with white if you want to bring something back. So using the color selection tool, I'm selecting white, and right here I may have gotten rid of a little bit too much. So I would be able to return the mask with the white tool. Unfortunately, it looks like when I was selecting the frog, I maybe cut out a little bit too much. So to show that it works, you can see here, you can bring back anything that's been masked out with exactly the color it had before. But this part right here, possibly missing a little bit of information. It's obvious when it's close up. So not ideal. And that just kind of demonstrates the point that when you edit your images, the less destructively you can do things, the better, because then you can reverse changes that you've made. So things like layer masks are really helpful so that you can decide when you want to hide something or show it. Okay, now let's go ahead and show off the text tool. Writing text on your document or creating a title is going to be pretty important, especially if you're like me and you make thumbnails all the time. So let's actually just go ahead and take this image and give it a title. So you can see here when I have the text tool selected, we have a font in the menu here. Your font probably won't be Big Noodle Titling. That's one I installed from online-to-font.com if you like the font. But you can select any font you have installed on your computer by clicking on this box here and just selecting from the drop-down menu. It'll give you the same selections that you have in the font window over here. So either way you want to do it, you can just find a font that you like to use. In my case, Big Noodle Titling is pretty good, as is Babus Noe, 2 free fonts you can install. So if you click anywhere on your document, you'll get a pop-up window with some information. It's going to, by default, contain the same settings that you have over in the text tool options over here. The difference is if you set a setting up here in the tool options, that'll be permanent until you change it here again. But if you change the settings, when you get this little pop-up menu, that will only be for this particular text box that you're creating. Let's go ahead and start typing something in. So I'll say GIMP tutorial here for right now. You notice that when I type in information, we have these 4 corners, which you can drag. So this is kind of like dragging the size of the layer. It'll determine things like when you're typing, when the new line will automatically start. So GIMP will try to make your text fit within the box you've created. So you just need to click on the sides or the corners in order to drag that, and you can position it wherever you want. Note that by default, the text is left aligned, so you have justify tools over here. You can center it if you want. If you don't like having to manually adjust the box, you can change the box mode from fixed to dynamic. So what that'll do is as you start typing, it will expand the box instead of moving to the next line. So basically the box will always kind of fit whatever you type in rather than the text fitting the box. But you can still manually adjust it if you need to expand it. So once you've created text, if you want to change the settings of text within the box, you actually need to select all the characters and then change the value on it. If I don't have anything selected and I type in something like 200, it changes nothing. So you select your text, so left click and then drag until you see these yellow boxes around all of your characters. And then you can change the font size. So you can scroll up on the middle mouse wheel if you want to adjust it in increments, or you can just type a value in, like 200. So let's adjust the box so that it can fit the text more properly. And maybe we increase it even more than that. So I'll make it like 250 there. At this point, we'd probably want to center the text, especially if it's a title. So one great way you can do that kind of thing within GIMP is to use guides. So to create a guide, which is basically a vertical line that you can snap to by moving objects or images around your screen, is to go up to the image menu, go down to guides here towards the bottom, and you can do new guide by %, or you can do it by pixels. Usually I'll do it by %. It's the easier way to center things because you don't need to know how big your document is. So you can do direction vertical if you want it to be a top-down guideline, or you can do it horizontal if you want it to be a left to right. Vertical at 50% is going to put this guideline right in between the middle of our image. Now you can actually move these guides if you want by hovering over it and left clicking and dragging it while it is glowing red. But what I actually want to do here is to take this text layer, which by the way, I don't actually want in the frog group, so I'm going to move that out of it. And we just left click on it with the move tool and drag it to the center. So when you move something, you'll see the little anchor point in the middle. So if that gets close to the blue line, it's going to snap to it. And if for some reason it's not snapping, you can go up to the view menu and make sure that snap to guides is turned on. One thing you'll notice about the text is that it's not particularly stand out in the areas that also have white in the background, like where this laptop screen is sitting there. So what we can do is apply the drop shadow filter to the text in order to add a black shadow behind it, which will make the text stand out a lot more. Now, before applying the drop shadow to the text, one thing that you should make sure is that the text box has the text at least a little bit away from all of the edges of the text box, because if you apply an effect like drop shadow to the box, these lines you see here are basically the boundaries of where the drop shadow can go. So if there was no pixel space between, let's say, the right side of this L and the right edge over here, what might happen is that part of the drop shadow effect would get cut off and it would look bad. So having extra space is a good idea so that your effect looks right when you actually apply it. So with the GIMP tutorial text layer selected, I can go up to filters and go down to light and shadow and do drop shadow. So when you do that, you should notice that there's a little bit of a soft shadow right behind the text immediately. You can turn off the preview to see what it looks before and after. My standard settings for what I want the text to really stand out is to put 10 pixels, is to put 10 for the X and Y size of the drop shadow, to take the blur radius and drop that down to 2, so it's much less blurry, and then to take the opacity and crank that all the way up to 2.0, so that the shadow is actually almost completely not transparent. But you can see if you look at the edges that it's not completely solid because there's still a little bit of blur radius. So we can hit OK there, and that gives us a decent looking drop shadow for our image. So now I want to show you guys one of my favorite tricks using the perspective tool. So the perspective tool you can find over here, it looks like a wireframe of a cube. And what perspective allows you to do is to take a otherwise flat image and manipulate the corners of that image in such a way where it looks like you brought the image into the document at an angle. So you can see in the background that the laptop screen has an angle to it. So if we tried to drop a square image onto it, it wouldn't make any sense because the four corners don't align perfectly in terms of their X or Y positions. So we would need to use the perspective tool if we wanted to, say, add a wallpaper to the laptop background, making it look like it was on. So I'm going to drop in this other image, and we're going to take this and try to make it appear on the laptop screen. So the first tool I'm going to use here is the scale tool. I will scale this way down until it is kind of a little bit bigger than the screen itself. I'll hit scale, and then I'm going to reposition this over the laptop. We'll also take this landscape layer and put it down there right above the home office layer, the bottom one, not the one in the frog group. So now we need to take this landscape layer and apply the perspective tool to it. So I'm going to left click with the perspective tool. And now it gives us four corners we can manipulate in order to make it look like it has the right perspective to fit on that laptop screen. So what you need to do now is to take the four corners and match them to the laptop's corners. We can hide the text layer so that we can see what we're doing while we do this. And we just need to take these and kind of position them at the four corners where the laptop screen is. So there's the right two positions and then the bottom left. And this one for the top left. So if you get it about right, you should get a good result. You can hit transform. And now just with that, you've magically made that image that definitely did not belong in the original shot look like it's actually fairly convincingly what is showing on the laptop screen. And as long as this layer is under the text layer, when we add the text back in, the text will properly appear above this layer. So that'll be a really cool effect for you guys to try out. A couple more useful tools I think we should cover on before we wrap up this giant tutorial would be the blur sharpen tool and the dodge burn tool. So with the blur sharpen tool, we can either blur out an area or take the pixels in it and make it have a sharper appearance. Now usually I think you would generally use this tool more for blurring. A really common example would be if you need to blur someone's face out. So just like with using a paintbrush tool or a pencil tool, you can draw over an object or a person. With this tool, you need to make sure you're on the right layer for that. So we can try to kind of blur the frog here on the frog layer. Make sure you don't select the layer mask, but the frog itself. And then if you zoom in, we can press and hold with this tool and kind of blur the face out a little bit. Now you see at these basic settings, it takes quite a while of going over it to actually make it blur out all that much. So if you want to make that go faster, try increasing the force and the size of your brush, and you should be able to get a blur much faster than before. Conversely, if you hold Control down to toggle it to sharpen, or you change the mode and the tool options to sharpen, then you can take these pixels and kind of remove some of the blurriness from it, making the pixels stand out a lot more. So you can see here that when we have the sharpen tool there, the colors stand out a lot more from each other. It might not really be what you're looking for in a lot of cases, but you may be able to find a use for that. Just make sure you don't go too overboard with the sharpening, or it'll just straight up look bad. So also worth mentioning about things like blur and sharpen is that in the filters menu, you'll find other options for doing the same kind of thing. But if you want to, say, apply a blur to everything in a layer, then you can go down here to the filters, to blur and Gaussian blur. And that could take an entire layer and apply a blur to it equally all at once. And you can increase the size of the blur if you want it to be more dramatic, or lower it down to be a more minor blur. So it just depends on if you're trying to blur out an entire layer or just manually blur out a little part of it. So with the dodge burn tool, you can lighten or darken part of your image. So when you have this tool selected, it still works like the brush tool. By default, you're doing dodge, which is going to lighten things. So if we wanted to take like the frog's back and kind of lighten it a bit, we can draw over it with the dodge tool. And you can see that it will get a lot more bright. So we might decide that, the shadows on the original frog were too harsh, so we could actually dodge those areas and to make it a lot brighter, like it was actually in a brighter lighting environment. Now, that was pretty sloppy the way I just did that there. But you can kind of get the idea. You can take something, you can make it lighter, make it look like there's a lot more lighting in that part of the image. And you can also reverse that either by holding Control down to switch to a burn, or clicking burn in the tool options, and you can start drawing over that. So you could take these shadow areas and make them even harsher. Maybe you do that to many areas of your image to kind of fake that the lighting is darker than it actually is. Note that this tool by default works on midtones, which are going to be the colors that are in the middle of whatever you're selecting with this dodge brush. But you can also target the shadows. So if you used shadows with burn, you can make the darker shadows look even darker compared to the rest of the areas. You see how that makes the blacks very, very black. But if you do it with the midtones, it kind of applies it a little bit more evenly. And if you did it with the highlights, it would be to take the brightest colors and make them darker. So not really making it look like there's harsher shadows, but rather that the whole thing is a little bit darker on average. So speaking of shadows, midtones, and highlights, there's a series of tools up in the color menu, which you can use to affect how a layer looks. So one of the ways you can do that is to affect the color balance of that layer. And when you go into this menu, you can see that you adjust either the shadows, the midtones, or the highlights individually. So if you wanted to adjust the color of the shadows, and that's going to be referring to the darker colors in whatever image or layer you're working on, then you can adjust the color specifically to those shadow areas. So I could take these shadows and make them red by increasing the red here. But notice that the area where it affects first are the darker colors. It doesn't affect these light greens as much. However, if I reset that, I go to the highlights and reset that as well, and now I increase the red on the highlights, you can see that it affects the whiter areas and possibly some of the green areas. I thought those are more of midtones. First, before it actually affects the other areas. And then midtones, I guess we can grab those greens. The majority of the colors seem to fall into the midtone range here. So by targeting color ranges, you can try to affect the shadows or the brightest areas of your image more so than the other areas. So it just kind of allows you to filter what you're trying to work on. So all of these tools you see in the color menu more or less work like that, where you take your image and you are able to adjust the colors or the luminosity or brightness of that layer that you're working on. So for instance, I can go to the exposure layer, and if I want everything to be a lot more shifted towards black, I can lower the exposure down, basically making it look like there was very little light in the shot. You can also play around with the black level, increasing it to make the shadows more dramatic and pulling inward. You can combine that with a low exposure too, if you wanted to take your image and make it darker. If you wanted to make a layer more black and white or very, very vivid, you could go up to colors and then saturation. Lowering the scale down to 0 makes it pure grayscale, and then if you increase it beyond 1, you can make the colors incredibly vivid, much more so than they were in the original image. Now, just to kind of recommend, if you're going to be applying these color filters over one of your layers, it might be a good idea to create a duplicate of that layer, and then hide the original, and work on the duplicated layer until you're sure that you want that to be the final look for your final result. Remember, one of the things about working in GIMP that's really important is to be as non-destructive to your original materials as possible, so you can always go back and make changes. Okay, so one more thing I want to point out, in the filters menu, there are many filters in here, but if you want to have even more options of these computer-generated effects that can get you quick results with very little manual effort, then there is a really great library that there's pretty much no reason not to go ahead and grab for yourself. It's called Gimmick. So Gimmick you can find at gimmick.eu, and this is basically a plugin that you can install. The version you would want to get is the one that's specifically for GIMP. If you have the latest version of GIMP, that would be the GIMP 2.10. There's a Windows installer. So you just go ahead, run that, install it, restart GIMP, and you'll see it in the filters menu. So with the Gimmick plugin, you can open it up, and there are 500 plus filters, currently 520, that you can apply on top of your image to manipulate it. So for instance, you can go through the different filters here. They're all categorized, and there's a lot to look through. You can also type in and see if there's a filter that you want. So you could try something like glow. There's a few different options here for glow. You can see in the preview window that you can take that original frog, and so you can give it light and blurriness, just by using one computer-generated effect and applying it to that image. Some other cool examples you might find in the artistic section. So for instance, if I go to artistic and I drop it down to hard sketch, you can see that it makes it kind of look like you were taking a pencil and sketching it out on paper. Or you might go down here and look for something a little bit weirder, like this Rodelius effect. So it just gives you a lot of really cool looks that you could apply to an image without too much of your own personal manual effort. And then of course there's settings you can play around with on the right to increase or decrease the amount of that effect. Very similar to the standard GIMP filters, except now you would get an extra 520 that you can apply on top of your image that you couldn't have before. So that will just give you a lot more power when you're actually editing your images. So that's pretty much going to be it for this tutorial, giving you guys a complete walkthrough of the GIMP program. Of course, there's more stuff that you can do within GIMP, but as far as things go, I've pretty much shown you guys all of the basics. You guys should understand layers now, many of the important tools, how to use filters, the color adjustment options, and the color composite modes, layer groups, layer masks, and more. So I hope you guys learned a lot. I've been Chris, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in my future video content.